In 1969, a psychologist reviewing old therapy footage noticed something almost by accident, a mistake he almost didn't catch. A patient on the tape was smiling, calm, reassuring. She told her doctor she was feeling much better, ready to go home for the weekend. 9 minutes later, alone with a razor blade she had smuggled into her room, she attempted to end her own life. The psychologist, a young researcher named Paul Ekman, went back to that footage obsessively, running it frame by frame, slower and slower, until he finally found it. A single frame, lasting a fraction of a second, buried inside that calm, reassuring smile, an expression of pure, undisguised despair, there and gone, before any human eye watching in real time could consciously register it. That single frame changed the entire field of deception detection. It proved that the face leaks the truth, even when a person is doing everything in their power to hide it. And in this video, we are going to show you exactly what that leak looks like, and the specific expression Ekman later identified as the single clearest signal of concealed guilt. Quick note before we start. If you watched our first file, you already know the foundation. Crime scenes, victimology, behavior under questioning. This video goes one layer deeper, into the face itself, the one part of the body almost nobody knows how to consciously control. By the end, you will never watch an interview, an interrogation, or even a dinner conversation the same way again. The patient in that 1969 footage is known in Ekman's published research under the pseudonym Mary. She was a middle-aged woman hospitalized for severe depression, and by the time that session was filmed, she had already made the decision to take her own life the moment she was granted a weekend pass. She understood correctly that acting calm and cooperative was her fastest route out the door. Her performance was, by any normal human standard, convincing. Her doctors believed her. It was only later, after her actual plan came to light, that anyone thought to review the footage again, and only Ekman's frame-by-frame analysis, run at a fraction of normal speed, revealed the flash of anguish she could not fully suppress, no matter how practiced her outward calm had become. This case became the seed of an entirely new research program. Ekman and his research partner, Wallace Friesen, began systematically studying what they eventually named Microexpressions. Full, genuine emotional expressions that flash across the human face in as little as 1/25th of a second, triggered by the same involuntary neural pathways that produce a startle reflex. You cannot fully train them away. You can only get faster at masking what comes after them. What made this discovery so significant for investigators was not just that these flashes exist, but that they are involuntary in a very specific, biologically stubborn way. The same muscles fire whether a person wants them to or not, because the signal originates in older, more primitive regions of the brain than the ones responsible for conscious self-presentation. By the time the thinking, self-monitoring part of the brain catches up and slams the mask back down, the true expression has already escaped, if only for a heartbeat. It is worth noting how close this discovery came to never happening at all. Ekman only reviewed the Mary footage a second time because a colleague, preparing a teaching reel, asked whether any of his interview tapes might be useful for a class on nonverbal communication. Without that almost accidental second look, run deliberately in slow motion rather than at normal viewing speed, the entire field of microexpression research might not exist in anything like its current form. The lesson embedded in the discovery itself became one of its own founding principles. At normal speed, the human eye simply is not fast enough to catch what the face is actually doing. Before any of this could be trusted as science rather than intuition, Ekman had to survive a fight with some of the most respected names in 20th century anthropology, and for years he was very much on the losing side of it. Ekman's early mentor, psychologist Sylvan Tompkins, was one of the first serious academics to argue that a small set of core facial expressions might be biologically hardwired into every human being, rather than learned through culture like language or table manners. It was a fringe position at the time. The dominant view, championed by towering figures, including anthropologist Margaret Mead, held that facial expression, like gesture and custom, was primarily shaped by upbringing and society, meaning a smile in one culture could plausibly mean something entirely different in another. Ekman set out, initially expecting to prove Tompkins wrong, or at least to find the cultural variation Mead's framework predicted. He traveled first to Japan, Brazil, and Argentina, then, more decisively, to the remote highlands of Papua New Guinea to study the Four People, a group who at that point had almost no exposure to outside media, photographs, or foreign visitors. If facial expression were culturally learned, this isolated population should have developed its own distinct visual vocabulary, unreadable to a Western observer. It had not, shown simple photographs of Western faces and asked to match them to short stories describing an emotional situation. The four identified anger, fear, disgust, sadness, surprise, and joy with the same consistency as test subjects in San Francisco. Ekman then filmed four tribespeople acting out those same emotional situations themselves and brought the footage home. American college students who had never seen a four tribesperson before correctly read the emotions on their faces at rates far beyond chance. The debate did not end quietly. Mead and her colleagues pushed back hard, and Ekman later described the professional cost of challenging such an established consensus as significant, including difficulty securing funding for years, while the data slowly accumulated in his favor. It is a useful reminder, for a channel built entirely on behavioral science, that even well-supported findings often have to survive real institutional resistance before they are accepted, and that being right early is not the same as being believed early. In his later research, compiled most famously in his book, Telling Lies, Ekman proposed that deception is rarely an emotionally neutral act. Lying about something that matters typically produces one or more of three specific emotional undercurrents, and each leaves its own distinct trace on the face if you know exactly where to look. The first is what Ekman called detection apprehension, the fear of being caught. This is not generalized nervousness. It is a specific, targeted fear tied directly to the lie itself, and it tends to spike at the exact moment a liar believes their story is being tested most closely, which is often not the moment you would expect. The second is deception guilt, genuine discomfort about the act of deceiving another person, distinct from guilt about whatever underlying act is being concealed. Some liars feel almost nothing about the underlying event, but feel real, visible discomfort about looking someone in the eye and feeding them a false account of it. The third, and by far the most counterintuitive, is what Ekman named duping delight. The flash of pleasure, even smugness, that some liars feel when they believe they are successfully getting away with it. It is the emotional opposite of what almost everyone expects to see on a guilty face, and it is precisely the expression this entire video is building toward. Ekman was careful to note that these three states are not mutually exclusive, and a single sustained lie can cycle through more than one of them. A high-stakes deception might open with a spike of fear at the very first question, settle into low-grade guilt through the middle of the exchange, and end with a flicker of duping delight the instant the liar believes the danger has passed. Reading a face accurately means tracking this sequence over time, not searching for a single static expression. Ekman also connected this back to his cross-cultural research through what he called display rules, culturally learned norms governing which emotions are considered acceptable to show openly and in front of whom. A culture that discourages open expressions of fear in front of authority figures does not eliminate the underlying fear leakage. It only changes how quickly and completely a person has practiced covering it. This is precisely why baseline observation of a specific individual will always outperform a generic, one-size-fits-all checklist applied uniformly across every subject, regardless of background. To understand why duping delight and microexpressions generally are so hard to suppress, it helps to understand a distinction Ekman drew between two completely separate neural pathways that control the human face. The first pathway is voluntary. It runs through the motor cortex, the same system that lets you consciously smile for a photograph, raise an eyebrow on command, or perform a friendly expression at a networking event you would rather not be attending. This pathway is slow, deliberate, and fully within conscious control. The second pathway is involuntary, running through older subcortical structures connected directly to the emotional centers of the brain. This is the system responsible for the genuine, spontaneous grin that appears the instant you see an old friend unexpectedly, or the wince that crosses your face a half-second before you consciously register pain. It is fast, automatic, and almost entirely outside voluntary control. When someone experiences a genuine emotion while actively trying to project a different one, both systems fire. But the involuntary system fires first, faster than the deliberate mask can be constructed and deployed. The result is a microexpression, a fragment of the true emotional pathway, leaking through before the voluntary pathway can finish overriding it. This is not a personality flaw or a sign of a bad liar. It is simply how the human nervous system is wired, and it applies, to some degree, to everyone. This same two-pathway model also explains why paralysis patients unable to voluntarily move one side of their face can still sometimes produce a full, symmetrical, genuine smile in response to real humor, using the involuntary pathway alone, even though they cannot replicate that same movement on command. It is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that these two systems are, physiologically, almost entirely separate circuits sharing the same muscles. Here is the expression this entire video has been building toward, the one Ekman himself pointed to repeatedly as one of the clearest and most reliable indicators of concealed guilt in a high-stakes lie. Duping delight. It typically appears as a brief, asymmetrical smile, often confined mostly to one side of the mouth, sometimes paired with a flash of brightness around the eyes that does not match the emotional tone of the conversation. It tends to surface at a very specific moment, immediately after a liar believes they have successfully cleared a moment of real risk, deflected a pointed question, or convinced their audience of something false. It is, in essence, the face briefly celebrating a small victory the person cannot afford to celebrate openly. This is precisely why duping delight is often more reliable, investigatively, than looking for fear. Fear is what most people expect to see on a guilty face, which means practiced liars spend most of their preparation trying to suppress exactly that signal. Almost nobody rehearses suppressing a smile of satisfaction because almost nobody expects to feel one or realizes they are about to. The stakes matter enormously here. Duping delight is rare in low-stakes lies, the small social fictions most people tell without a second thought. It becomes far more visible in high-stakes deception, where the liar has something significant to lose if caught, and something significant, often an audience's belief or admiration, to gain if the deception succeeds. The higher the emotional stakes, the more likely that fleeting flash of pleasure becomes, precisely because there is finally something genuinely exciting to feel pleased about. Public figures caught in scandal have, on more than one occasion, been captured on camera producing exactly this expression in the middle of a denial, a flicker of satisfaction at having, they believed in that instant, gotten away with it. Analysts reviewing this kind of footage after the fact consistently point to the same signature. The smile arrives at the wrong moment, is asymmetrical, and vanishes almost immediately, replaced by a hastily reconstructed expression of solemn concern that arrives just a beat too late to fully cover the tracks. There is also a performative version worth distinguishing from the genuine article. Some experienced deceivers, aware that a completely blank or overly serious face reads as suspicious in itself, will consciously insert small, controlled smiles into a denial to appear relaxed and confident. The difference is timing and symmetry. A performed reassurance smile tends to be deployed deliberately, evenly, and in sync with the rhythm of the sentence being spoken. Genuine duping delight arrives slightly out of sync, asymmetrical, and very briefly, almost as an interruption rather than a planned beat. Since these three emotional undercurrents can each leave a distinct trace, it helps to know specifically what to look for beyond duping delight, because a skilled observer is really watching for a shifting pattern across several possible signals, not just one. Fear leakage typically shows up around the eyes and brow before anywhere else. The inner corners of the eyebrows pull upward and together. The upper eyelid raises slightly higher than normal, and the lips sometimes stretch horizontally, tightening back toward the ears rather than pressing together. This combination happens in a fraction of a second and is often gone before the rest of the face reorganizes into whatever expression the person intends to project. Guilt is subtler and more variable across individuals, but frequently appears as a brief downward cast of the eyes, combined with a slight tightening at the corners of the mouth, sometimes accompanied by a small, almost apologetic head tilt. Unlike fear, guilt tends to build gradually across a conversation rather than spiking sharply at a single moment, which makes it easier to miss if you are only watching for a single dramatic flash. Contempt has a signature that, once you know it, is almost impossible to unsee. A unilateral tightening and slight raising of just one corner of the lip, without the eye engagement of a genuine smile, and without the bilateral symmetry of an honest expression. Ekman considered contempt one of the most dangerous signals to miss in any high-stakes interaction, precisely because it indicates active disdain hidden beneath a composed surface. And because, unlike fear or guilt, contempt often signals someone who does not feel they have done anything wrong at all. The single most important habit across all four of these signals is the same one we introduced in our first file. None of them mean anything read in isolation, out of context, from a stranger you have never observed before. A furrowed brow might be fear leakage in one person, and simply their resting expression of concentration in another. This is why every serious application of this method still begins with the same unglamorous first step. Watch, establish a baseline, and only then start weighing what changes. A useful way to hold all four signals in mind at once is to think of them less as four separate signs to memorize, and more as four possible directions a face can move away from its own resting state. Fear pulls up and in. Guilt pulls down and inward. Contempt pulls sideways and asymmetrical. Duping delight lifts briefly and unevenly, then vanishes. The direction of the movement, relative to that person's own baseline, will always tell you more than trying to match what you see against a mental photograph of a textbook expression. None of this would be usable in any rigorous, teachable way without the tool Ekman and Friesen spent years building. The Facial Action Coding System, or FACS, a comprehensive anatomical map of every distinct movement the human face is capable of producing, broken down into individually numbered action units. A genuine smile of real enjoyment, sometimes called a Duchenne smile after the 19th century researcher, who first documented it, involves two action units working together. The zygomatic major, which pulls the corners of the mouth upward, and the orbicularis oculi, the muscle around the eye that produces the small creases at the outer corners, popularly known as crow's feet. A performed smile, generated consciously without genuine underlying enjoyment, activates the mouth alone. The eyes remain flat, uninvolved, betraying the performance to anyone trained to look. Duping delight specifically tends to combine an asymmetrical activation of the lip corner, meaning one side of the mouth pulls up more visibly than the other, which is itself a signal of a suppressed or deliberately controlled expression, since fully genuine, spontaneous emotion is almost always symmetrical across both sides of the face. Fax was built to be exhaustive rather than intuitive, cataloging more than 40 individual action units and thousands of possible combinations, and certified fax coders traditionally required roughly 100 hours of training before being considered reliable. This is part of why the system, for all its scientific value, never translated cleanly into a quick checklist for field use, a tension that becomes very important a few chapters from now. If reading deception this precisely sounds almost impossible for an ordinary person, Ekman and his longtime collaborator, psychologist Maureen O'Sullivan, set out in the 1990s to answer a genuinely fascinating question. Does anyone actually do this well, consistently, in the real world, without any special training at all? Over more than a decade, they tested thousands of people using standardized videos of both truthful and deceptive statements, drawn largely from professionals whose jobs demanded reading people accurately. Law enforcement officers, judges, therapists, federal agents, and interested members of the public who volunteered to be tested. The overwhelming majority performed at or barely above chance, echoing what deception research had found again and again in other studies. But a very small number of people, roughly 50 individuals identified across the entire multi-year project, performed at extraordinarily high accuracy, consistently above 80%, across multiple independent tests. Ekman and O'Sullivan called them truth wizards. Notably, they came from an unusually wide range of backgrounds. Several were Secret Service agents specializing in protective work. Some were therapists who had spent careers working with deeply guarded, high-conflict patients, and a handful had no professional connection to deception detection at all. What set the wizards apart, based on follow-up interviews, was not raw intelligence or any single specialized technique. It was an almost obsessive attentiveness to small, specific detail, a willingness to notice one narrow inconsistency, a mismatched pause, an expression that arrived a beat too early, rather than forming a fast, holistic gut impression the way most people do. In other words, the wizards were, in effect, natural practitioners of the exact discipline this entire channel is built around. Patient, granular, baseline-driven observation, rather than snap judgment. It is worth being precise about what this project does and does not prove. 50 exceptional performers identified out of many thousands tested is strong evidence that expert-level deception detection is possible for some people. It is not evidence that this skill is common, easily taught in a weekend seminar, or reliably achievable by everyone who studies this material closely. The honest takeaway is a sharpened version of the same principle from earlier in this series. Attention and patience genuinely help, but near-perfect accuracy remains rare even among people who do this professionally for a living. One pattern that repeated across several of the wizards interviewed for the project stood out in particular. Many described not trusting their first impression at all, actively working against the pull of an instant gut read and forcing themselves to keep watching for a second, third, even fourth, confirming or disconfirming detail before settling on a judgment. In a field where most people, including many professionals, form a snap verdict in the first few seconds, and then spend the rest of the conversation unconsciously defending it. That single habit of deliberately delaying judgment may be the most teachable part of the entire Wizards project. To see how all of this fits together in practice, walk through a single composite interview with us, built from patterns common across real cases, rather than any one specific file. Subject A is brought in for questioning about a break-in at a location he claims he has not visited in months. In the first 2 minutes, the interviewer asks nothing about the case at all: commute, weather, weekend plans. This is the baseline phase from our first file, and it establishes Subject A's resting pace of speech, his default posture, and a habit of maintaining fairly steady, unremarkable eye contact while relaxed. When the conversation turns to the night in question, 2 things shift almost immediately. His speech rate slows, each sentence noticeably more measured than his baseline chatter about traffic and weekend plans, consistent with the deliberate, careful construction of statement analysis we covered earlier, rather than the looser, more chronological structure of a freely recalled memory. And for a fraction of a second, as he states that he has not been near the location in months, his inner eyebrows draw together and upward, the fear leakage pattern from Chapter 6, gone before he finishes the sentence. Neither signal, alone, proves anything, but a few minutes later, when the interviewer mentions, without accusation, that a witness placed a car matching his outside the location that week, something else appears. A brief asymmetrical lift at one corner of his mouth, arriving not at the moment of denial, but a beat after, once he has finished his response and believes the moment has passed cleanly, duping delight, exactly where the chapter on it predicted it would surface, precisely because he believes in that instant that he has successfully managed the risk. This is what triangulation actually looks like in practice. Not one dramatic tell that ends the interview, but a layered pattern, a slowed statement, a flash of fear at the first denial, a flash of premature relief after the second, that together justify a specific follow-up line of questioning rather than a verdict. The interviewer does not accuse Subject A of lying based on his face. The interviewer simply knows, now, exactly where to press next. Ekman's research did not stay in the academic world for long. Following the September 11th attacks, U.S. federal agencies moved aggressively to operationalize behavioral detection at scale, and one of the most visible results was the Transportation Security Administration's Screening of Passengers by Observation Techniques program, widely known as SPOT, which trained officers to identify a checklist of behavioral indicators, including facial cues drawn from this same body of research, among travelers passing through airport security. The program launched in 2007 and eventually trained thousands of behavior detection officers stationed at airports across the country, screening millions of travelers over more than a decade, flagging individuals for secondary screening based on observed behavior rather than any physical evidence or watch list match. Officers were trained to look for specific combinations of nervousness indicators, gaze avoidance, and facial tension patterns drawn loosely from the same research tradition we have spent this video explaining. This is also, however, the clearest real-world example of why behavioral science insists these signals must never be used in isolation, a point we are going to return to directly in the next chapter, because SPOT eventually became a genuinely important case study in exactly what happens when this kind of technique is deployed without sufficiently rigorous validation, at enormous operational scale, under enormous time pressure. In the interest of the same intellectual honesty we promised in our first file, this part matters as much as everything that came before it. In 2013, the United States Government Accountability Office published a formal review of the SPOT program and reached a blunt conclusion. There was no scientifically validated evidence that the specific behavioral indicators being used to flag travelers were an effective method of identifying deception or threat risk at rates meaningfully better than random chance in that specific operational context, despite the program having already cost hundreds of millions of dollars to operate by that point. This finding did not erase the underlying laboratory research behind microexpressions, which remains a well-documented feature of human facial physiology. What it exposed was a much narrower, more important problem: the gap between a real phenomenon studied carefully in a controlled research setting and a simplified checklist version of that phenomenon applied quickly, under pressure, by officers scanning thousands of unfamiliar faces a day, with no opportunity to establish any individual baseline first. This is exactly the same baseline principle we introduced in our very first video, and it applies here with even more force. A microexpression only means something once you know how a specific person's face moves when they are calm and telling the truth. Without that baseline, a fleeting expression tells you almost nothing reliable about a stranger walking past your checkpoint at a rate of 1 every few seconds. The lesson trained investigators actually take from this is not that facial expressions are useless. It is that facial cues are one data point among several, most useful, when layered with verbal statement analysis, established baseline behavior, and the broader behavioral profiling framework we covered in our first file. Never as a standalone checklist applied to a stranger in a matter of seconds. It is worth noting that SPOT was eventually scaled back significantly following the GAO report, though versions of behavioral detection training continue in modified form at agencies around the world. The program's rise and partial fall is now taught in some criminology programs, specifically as a case study in the difference between a scientifically grounded starting point and a poorly validated operational deployment, a distinction this entire video has tried to keep in view from the opening frame onward. In the years since SPOT drew public scrutiny, a new generation of technology companies has tried to solve the same underlying problem with software instead of human observers. Automated emotion recognition systems, trained on large datasets of labeled facial expressions, designed to flag microexpressions and emotional states algorithmically, in real time, without requiring years of fax training. These systems have been piloted in contexts ranging from job interview screening to classroom attention monitoring to, in some proposed law enforcement applications, real-time interrogation support. The pitch is straightforward. Remove human inconsistency and fatigue from the equation, and let a trained model catch what a tired officer near the end of a long shift might miss. The scientific response has been, to put it mildly, cautious. Researchers studying these systems have repeatedly found that automated emotion recognition often performs inconsistently across different ethnic backgrounds, age groups, and even something as simple as differing rates of everyday facial expressiveness between individuals, precisely because these models are usually trained on datasets that do not represent the full diversity of real human faces and expressive styles. A 2019 review commissioned by the Association for Psychological Science, examining decades of emotion research, concluded that the scientific evidence does not support the idea that a person's emotional state can be reliably, universally decoded from facial movement alone by any observer, human or algorithmic, without accounting for context and individual variation. This is not a rejection of Ekman's original research, which focused specifically on the existence and universality of a handful of core emotional expressions, not on the much larger and shakier claim that any fleeting expression can be automatically translated into a specific verdict about deception. It is a reminder that the distance between a real, replicated scientific finding and a marketed technological product is often much larger than the marketing suggests, and it is exactly the kind of gap this channel exists to help you see clearly. There is a newer wrinkle worth naming directly. The same generative technology now capable of producing convincing synthetic video is also, in principle, capable of synthesizing a fake microexpression or removing a genuine one from footage after the fact. Digital forensics teams are actively developing detection methods for exactly this kind of manipulation. But it means the honest, cautious framework this video has built. Layered evidence, established baselines, healthy skepticism toward any single dramatic tell is likely to matter even more in the coming years, not less, as the underlying footage itself becomes a less automatically trustworthy witness. Given how briefly a genuine microexpression appears, often less than a fifth of a second, a natural question is whether ordinary people can realistically learn to catch them at all without slow-motion video. Ekman's own answer to this question was a specific training tool he developed called the Microexpression Training Tool. Built around repeated exposure to expressions flashed for progressively shorter durations, paired with immediate feedback on accuracy. Research using this kind of training protocol found that most participants could measurably improve their detection accuracy after only a few hours of focused practice, though improvement plateaus well short of perfect performance for almost everyone, professionals included. The practical skill worth building is not freeze-frame perfect recognition. It is a habit of watching the transition points in any serious conversation. The exact moment a difficult question lands. The half-second immediately after someone finishes a rehearsed-sounding answer. The instant before a composed expression is deliberately reconstructed. Genuine leakage tends to cluster around exactly these transition points, which means you do not need to catch every frame. You need to know where to be looking when it counts. It is also worth building the habit of watching for asymmetry specifically, since it is one of the more visible cues even at normal speed. A smile, a frown, a raised brow that appears clearly stronger on one side of the face than the other is one of the more reliable outward signs that an expression is being consciously managed rather than felt spontaneously, precisely because genuine. Fully involuntary emotion tends to engage both sides of the face close to equally. As with everything in this series, almost none of this requires an interrogation room to matter. It requires attention, patience, and a baseline, in exactly the same order we described in our first file. Watch the transition moments. The half-second right after someone answers a question they clearly did not want asked. The flicker that crosses a face immediately after delivering news they claim to feel sorry about. The asymmetry in a reassurance that should, if genuine, look identical on both sides of the face. And remember the paradox at the center of this entire video. The expression most worth noticing is very often not fear, and it is almost never the exaggerated nervousness popular culture trained you to expect. It is a flash of relief, or satisfaction, or quiet pleasure, arriving at exactly the moment someone believes they have gotten away with something. That flash, more than almost any other single signal covered in this series, is the face telling the truth for a 25th of a second before the mask comes back down. None of this makes you a certain judge of anyone's honesty, and no serious investigator would ever claim otherwise. What it gives you, used carefully and combined with everything else in this series, is exactly what the FBI's own behavioral scientists have always claimed for this method. Not proof, but a sharper, more disciplined kind of attention, the same discipline that separated the 50 truth wizards from the thousands of people tested alongside them. This video covered the face, where microexpressions come from, why the involuntary pathway cannot be fully suppressed, the three emotional undercurrents behind most high-stakes lies, the single expression, duping delight, that Ekman himself considered one of the clearest signals of concealed guilt in the entire system, the rare people who read faces almost perfectly, and where this science was pushed too far, both by a federal screening program and by a new generation of software trying to automate what even trained humans still struggle to do reliably. One last thought before we close this file. Everything covered across these 2 episodes: crime scenes, victimology, statement structure, and now the face itself, exists for the same reason the original behavioral science unit was built in the first place. Not to give any one person a magic trick for catching every liar, but to replace snap judgment with patient, structured observation. That shift, more than any single tell covered in either video, is the actual skill worth taking with you. In the next video, we are going back into the interrogation room itself, breaking down, step by step, the 9 stages of the read technique real investigators use to move a suspect from flat denial to a full confession. If you want to understand exactly how that room works, subscribe now. This was only the second file.